Started. How many of you in here, by a show of hands, know who Demi Lovato is? Raise your hand if you know who Demi Lovato is. See, this is better numbers than we had up in Conifer when I preached this. So that's right. Well, I want to share a little bit about her life because her life story is really a powerful one. She's a pop singer in her late 20s. I think she's 28 now, and she has had a very difficult life. When she was young, her parents went through a really nasty divorce, and her dad was an alcoholic. He was abusive to the family. He was a drug addict, and he had a lot of issues. So after the divorce, Demi, when she was growing up, she tried to have that relationship with him, and she tried to nurture that relationship. But the more she did, the more she realized he's still that same mean, alcoholic, drug addict dad. And she even coined the phrase, he's going to end up dying alone because of the way he treats people. Well, sure enough, a few years later, in her young teenage years, he did die. And he actually was in his house dead for a week and a half before people found him. He died that alone. Now, as you can imagine, this kind of trauma followed Demi Lovato throughout her life. By the time she was 17 years old, she was world famous. This is why most people know her. She was famous on the Disney Channel. She was in many shows and movies. She even had some hit songs that played on the radio. And that was 17 years old. By 18, she had become even more famous and more popular. But behind the scenes over those 2 years, she had become completely dependent on alcohol and used cocaine multiple times a day. See, that trauma had followed her and haunted her entire life. And eventually, her coworkers and her family sat her down and they said, we need to go to rehab. We need to get you better. So she went into rehab, and she got out. I guess that was 19 years old. And after getting out, it wasn't long before she relapsed again. One of her managers came out during that time after she got out and told the story about how she would go on stage and she would promote this new way of life, of this sobriety, and she would go and encourage all these young girls to stay sober and abstain from drugs and alcohol. And then she would get off stage and go back there and start using drugs again. Well, Demi Lovato came out recently and talked about one of the moments where she had a wake-up call. It was about this same time when she was kind of living this double life. She woke up in her car one morning at 9 a.m., still drunk from the night before, and she said she had a bottle of Sprite in her hand full of vodka that she had been drinking. And she had been throwing up on herself, and she had drugs in the car with her. And she remembers thinking to herself, I am just like my dad. So as you can imagine, this sent her into another direction where she said, I need to get better. So she went into another rehab facility, and she was able to continue in her music career while staying sober during all of that. And it lasted for a while. But in 2018, she released a song called Sober. And this was her way of telling her friends and family that she wasn't sober anymore, that she had relapsed once again. Now, I tell you all of that to tell you this. She wrote one of her most recent songs in 2018 called Anyone. And it's a song about begging for people to listen to the pain and struggles that she was feeling in life. I want to read the lyrics to you because they're really powerful. She says, I tried to talk to my piano. I tried to talk to my guitar. I talked to my imagination, confided into alcohol. I tried and tried and tried some more, told secrets till my voice was sore. I'm tired of empty conversations because no one hears me anymore. 100 million stories and 100 million songs. I feel stupid when I sing. Nobody's listening to me. Nobody's listening. I talk to shooting stars, but they always get it wrong. I feel stupid when I pray. So why am I praying anyway if nobody's listening? Anyone, please send me anyone. Lord, is there anyone? I need someone. 100 million stories and 100 million songs. I feel stupid when I sing. Nobody's listening to me. Nobody's listening. What Demi Lovato is singing about is a heartbreaking reality that a lot of people face. She had a hard life. She struggled with addiction and mental health problems, and when she felt like she needed somebody to talk to, she felt that nobody was there. And that's where this song is coming from. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt like you were so deep in your struggles that you had nobody you could talk to? Have you ever struggled so much that you felt like you couldn't even pray? You see, I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we felt that. And if we haven't, we will at some point. You see, we all have been there where we feel like we just need someone to talk to, someone to listen to us and to hear our pain, but we feel like nobody is listening. The thing that she missed in her song is that people are listening. And the Bible lays out a great truth about help in times of struggle. Now, I'm not sure there's really any one passage that we can go to show this. So today I want to look at 4 passages about help in times of struggle. And what we're going to see is that when we struggle, someone is listening to us. So the first passage I want you to turn to is in 1 Peter chapter 5. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 5. And the first person we're going to see is God. When we struggle, God is listening to us. If you look at 1 Peter 5, down in verse 6, Peter lays out some truths about God that we can take out of this passage. He says in 1 Peter 5, verse 6, "Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time." Now look at verse 7. "Casting all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." Now, I want you to keep in mind who Peter is writing to here. This is a group of Christians who have suffered and they have faced persecution, and they're enduring all of this on a daily basis. They're being tried and tested in their faith. And Peter writes to encourage them and to try to push them on towards faithfulness and to keep them faithful to Christ. And when you come to this passage, you see this idea that Peter wants them to humble themselves and to cast all of their anxiety on God. Now, I want you to think about, in the face of persecution and suffering, what kind of anxieties would these people have? They would wonder if they would make it home to their family that day. They might wonder if they would even get to eat another meal. They may wonder if their family's going to be home when they get there. It may be the very last day that they're alive on this earth. These people had some real anxieties to worry about in the face of suffering and persecution. Now, what's really important is why Peter says to cast those anxieties onto God. Look at verse 7. He says, "Casting all your anxiety onto him because he cares for you." You see, Peter's telling these suffering Christians that God is there waiting for them and begging them to cast that anxiety onto him, to hand their struggles over. It's the idea of transferring the weight that you're carrying to somebody else. In this case, it's God. And Peter tells these Christians this great truth, that when they are struggling, God is listening to them. You know, it's interesting, when you get married, a lot of y'all will be able to relate to this, you have to learn how to function as one entity and no longer 2 separate people. And that's the challenging part, isn't it? You see, it takes letting go of some pride and realizing that your spouse is there to help you. It took me a long time to realize that with Katie, that she was there to help me work through struggles. And when I realized that, I was able to let go of some of my pride and hand over my struggles to her, and we could carry the weight for each other and help each other. And now we don't face anything alone. We work together to get through hardship. Well, that's what Peter's telling these Christians to do with God, to work as one with God, to cast your anxiety and let him carry that weight for you because he cares for you. You ever have a hard time sharing your struggles with God? You know, I think that's something that I struggle with. We want to be strong and courageous and heroic, and we want people to see us as this strong Christian, and we don't want to let them know that we struggle, and especially not God, right? He's the one that's going to judge us. We don't want him to know we're struggling. But what he tells us here is that he's waiting for us to share those struggles with him. He's waiting for us to cast that weight of our anxieties onto him because he cares for us. You know, I understand not sharing your struggles with someone who doesn't care about you, but God cares about you, doesn't he? Didn't he come to this earth and die for us? And what he wants us to know is that he's standing there waiting to help us when times get hard, waiting to help us carry the weight of the burdens that we face in life. What we see is that God is on our side, and we don't have to face struggles alone. When we struggle, God is listening to us. Now, the second passage I want to look at is in Hebrews chapter 2. You'll turn to Hebrews chapter 2. And the second person we see here in this passage is Jesus. When we struggle, Jesus is listening to us. Look down at Hebrews 2, verse 18. In this passage, we learn a lot about Jesus and the life he lived. It says in verse 18, "For since he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted." Now, what's interesting is if you back up a few verses to verse 14, you start to see this concept about mankind and Jesus being brothers. Not in the sense that they're both Christians, but in the sense that they shared in humanity, and they shared in flesh and blood and suffering. Look at verse 14 of chapter 2. It says, "Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself partook of the same." See, he became flesh and blood just like we are. And if you look at verse 16, it says, "For assuredly he doesn't give help to angels, but to Abraham's descendants." So it says because he became flesh and blood, he's able to help Abraham's descendants. That's Christians today. We are the descendants of Abraham. If you look at verse 17 and 18, it says, "Therefore, he had to become like his brothers in all things, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For since he himself suffered when he was tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted." So what's the writer trying to tell us here? He's telling us that Jesus gets us. He understands what it's like to live a difficult life. He's been through all of it. Did Jesus suffer? Think about the life he lived. Every town he went to, there were people who mocked him and ridiculed him and ran him out of town. He was kicked and punched and spit on. And eventually he was whipped and had his back shredded open, nails driven through his hands, and hung on a cross to suffocate and die. Did Jesus suffer? You bet he did. Now don't think he just suffered physically. What about emotions and mental struggles? Remember the scene in the garden where he was sweating great drops of blood? And he said, "God, if there's any other way for me to go through this, help me. Give me another way. But not my will, but your will be done." You think that was hard? What about when Satan tempted him in the wilderness and he hadn't eaten for 40 days? And Satan said, "Take this rock and turn it into bread." You know you want to. You think that was hard not to do? You see, Jesus suffered. What about financially? We don't think about that. In Jesus' ministry, he didn't have a home to go to. His family ridiculed him and called him a lunatic. He'd lost his senses. He slept on Peter's floor, which Peter probably slept on the floor, but you get the point. He didn't have a home to go to. Jesus struggled. The point that we're making here is Jesus knows what it's like to live a difficult life. He's been there. He's been through every piece of it. Hebrews 4:15 said, he was tempted in all ways. Jesus understands what it's like. And according to this passage, because he went through that, he's able to offer help to us. When we suffer, Jesus is listening and he's there waiting to help us. You ever gotten any advice from someone who wasn't qualified to give you advice? I find that interesting. You know, somebody who's never had kids tells you how to raise your kids. Or somebody who's never been married tells you the solution to fix your marriage. Or somebody who's never lost a loved one tells you how to mourn the loss of your loved one. You see, and I've even given that kind of advice from out of ignorance. But Jesus isn't that, is he? Jesus understands every aspect of life because he's been there and he's suffered through it. And because of that, he's able to help us. When we suffer, Jesus listens to us and he understands us and he's waiting to help us. Do you see him that way? Do you see Jesus as that good friend who wraps his arm around you at the funeral and says, "Brother, I know what it's like. I'm here to help you. I've been there." Because that's who he is. He's the guy who understands us. He's the guy who feels our pain. He felt every bit of it. Is Jesus someone you look at when you face struggles? Do you look at his life and learn how you can overcome things the way he did? Do you ever pray to Jesus? See, this passage tells that he is there waiting to help us when we struggle, waiting to get us through our hard times. What we see here is that when we struggle, Jesus is listening to us. Now, the third passage I want to look at is in Romans chapter 8. You turn to Romans chapter 8, and the third person we see in this passage is the Holy Spirit. When we struggle, the Holy Spirit is listening to us. Look at Romans chapter 8, and we're going to read verse 26 and 27. Romans 8, 26 and 27. It says, "In the same way, the Spirit helps our weakness, For we do not know how to pray as we should, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. But he who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. Now, there's a lot packed into that verse. I think there's some context here that can help us see what's going on. If you look back at verse 22, you really see three different things that are groaning here. In verse 22, it says, the whole creation groans and suffers. In verse 23, it says, we ourselves groan. And in verse 26, the Spirit himself intercedes with groanings. And now this idea of groans is interesting because it really means to express great concern or stress. And that's what Paul says the creation is doing and has been since the first sin came into the world. It's been expressing this great concern and stress. Now, I think we understand mankind definitely does that. We express this great concern and stress. But what's interesting is that the Spirit does that. And he's not doing it for himself, but this passage says he's interceding for us. And he goes on behalf of us to God and groans and expresses our great concern and stress to God. So really what we see happening here is this Holy Spirit, a piece of the Godhead, living inside of us and groaning on their behalf to God, expressing their deepest and darkest trials and struggles that they face to God on their behalf. What we see here is that when we struggle, the Holy Spirit's listening to us and waiting to help us work through those things and express those things to God. You ever had a friend that was such a good friend, they could always tell when something was bothering you? Just by looking at your facial expression, they could read your mind. Or a friend that could finish your sentences for you. Heidi always gets mad at me and Katie because we finish each other's sentences. Those are the kind of friends that they can look at your face and know everything you're feeling. They know everything you're going through. That's what the Holy Spirit is for us. It's our best friend that lives inside of us and understands what we feel and understands what we're going through. The Holy Spirit can finish our sentences and express those to God. He can formulate our thoughts before we can even formulate our thoughts. You see, that's what the Holy Spirit does for us. So I want to wrap our heads around this because this is a deep subject here. God gave each one of us the Holy Spirit when we were baptized. Acts 2:38. And that Spirit lives within us, according to 1 Corinthians 6:19. And that Spirit serves as a seal and a down payment for God to get you back at the end of time, according to Ephesians 1:13 and 14. Now here's what's cool. While we are on this earth, waiting for that time when we can go back, that Holy Spirit is groaning for us, living inside of us, hearing our pain and our struggles, and expressing those things to God, our deepest and darkest struggles. Now, I don't know about you, but that's one of the most comforting things I've ever read. To know that a piece of God is living inside of me and understands what I go through. You see, when we face struggles, one of the greatest things we can do is realize what the Holy Spirit is doing within us and expressing our greatest concerns and stresses to God. We just have to be people who acknowledge that and utilize the Holy Spirit for what He's doing and say, Spirit, I can't even put my thoughts into words and what I'm feeling. Can you express what I'm feeling to God for me? Because that's what He's there for. You see, when we struggle, the Holy Spirit listens to us. Now, the fourth passage I want to look at is in Galatians chapter 6. And the fourth person that we see is the church. When we struggle, the church is listening to us. Now, this passage, I think, can get overlooked in a topic like this. And if you're like me, I think you're willing to acknowledge that God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit are all listening to us and waiting to help us. I get that. But if you're like me, you say, what about somebody that can put their arm around me? Somebody I can look face to face and we can cry together and hug each other. What about that? Well, God gave us that too. Look at Galatians 6 and verse 1 and 2. It says, Brethren, if anyone is caught in a trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. You see, what this passage shows us is that Christians are supposed to help each other overcome sin. And they're supposed to bear each other's burdens. And that's what is fulfilling the law of Christ. If you look down at verses 9 and 10, you see a little bit more about this. It says, let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially those of the household of faith. This passage shows that it's not a one-time helping, but it's a continual doing good to all people, but especially Christians. You see, what this passage is showing us is that when Christians are really living like Christians, and they are fulfilling the law of Christ and living out Galatians 6, 1 and 2, they're going to be people who are there helping overcome sin, helping each other work through problems, bearing each other's burdens, carrying the weight for each other. What we see here is that the church should be one of the most immediate sources of help when we struggle. What we see here is that when we struggle, the church is listening to us. It's kind of like when people join into these AA groups or these addiction groups. They become a part of a community of people that talks about the things they're struggling with, that help each other work through the things they're facing. They give each other tools to get through those situations. And that's what the church should be for each other. According to Galatians 6, the church should be this kind of support group for each other. Is that what our churches look like? Do our churches look like what we're reading here? Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not telling you need to come up to the front of the auditorium and confess everything you've ever done to every member of the congregation. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is we need to learn how to talk to each other when we're struggling. We need to find someone that we can confide in, someone who's a Christian who can help us bear that load. It's interesting. Galatians 6:1 says, "You who are spiritual." Are any of us spiritual? It says, "You who are spiritual, restore the brother caught in sin." Do we ever get caught in sin? So if we have spiritual people and people who get caught in sin, why aren't we helping each other like this passage says to? Why have we convinced ourselves that we can't talk to each other about our struggles? You see, when we really strive to become the people who are fulfilling the law of Christ, we're there for each other. Not just this side where the spiritual people is willing to listen, but also this side where the one caught in sin and the one struggling is willing to go talk. You see, we have to work together. We have to learn how to share our struggles with each other. And this is what Paul says spiritual people who are fulfilling the law of Christ do. And I sure hope that describes every one of us, right? I think we're all spiritual people trying to fulfill the law of Christ. What we need to realize is that we all love each other. And when we struggle, the church is here listening to us, waiting to help us. And if we're not, we need to fix that too. The church needs to be a group of people who's willing to listen and willing to help. And that's what Paul is pointing out here. When we struggle, the church is listening to us. You know, many times in our churches, we have members who come in here on Sundays and Wednesdays, and they sit in these pews, and they've got their nice coat and tie on, and they put a smile on, but on the inside, they're dying. And they sit in these pews, and they struggle, and they face this suffering all alone. Because for some reason, we have convinced ourselves that we can't talk about our struggles, that we can't talk about it when we suffer. Well, I've got news for you. We suffer, don't we? I would argue that the Bible portrays Christians as the most suffering people there are. So why have we convinced ourselves that we can't talk about it with each other? You know, this sermon is really a response to Demi Lovato's song that I mentioned. She wrote that song in a place of pain, wondering why nobody could hear her, why nobody could listen to the things she was going through. She was troubled. She had mental health struggles. She had an eating disorder. Her dad died young and was a drug addict. She was an addict herself. She had a hard life. And you know the saddest part about the story behind that song? 4 days after she recorded that song, she overdosed on cocaine and heroin. 4 days after singing these words, I tried to talk to my piano. I tried to talk to my guitar. I talked to my imagination, confided into alcohol. I tried and tried and tried some more, told secrets till my voice was sore. I'm tired of empty conversation because no one hears me anymore. 4 days after singing those words, she overdosed because she felt like nobody was listening to her. You know, she spent months in the hospital recovering from that. And you know what she said recently in an interview? She said, I was searching for all of the answers to my problems in drugs and alcohol and music and sex and all of these different things. And it wasn't until I almost died that I realized the answers were in God. Now, I don't think she's a New Testament Christian, but that truth is true, isn't it? What I've tried to point out today is that we don't have to face our struggles alone, that we don't have to suffer by ourselves, that people are listening to us. And church, I'm begging you, don't bring yourself to the point that Demi Lovato did. Don't let yourself go to the point of death or to the lowest point possible in your life before you reach out and talk to someone. What I've tried to point out today is that when we struggle, God is listening, Jesus is listening, the Holy Spirit is listening, and the church is listening. So this week, what I want you to do, I want you to be very honest with yourself. I want you to look at your life and see what your personal struggle is, what you're going through that's causing you to suffer. It might be something spiritual, your relationship with God. It might be some temptation or some sin. It might be marriage or kids. Maybe it's something physical or financial. Whatever your struggle is, I want you to find that out. And I want you to do something. I want you to confide in someone. First, I want you to confide in God, the Father, Son, and the Spirit. I want you to pray to them and talk to the Godhead, because we have seen that God is waiting for us to help, for us to go to Him for help, because He wants to help us, because He cares for us. And the second person I want you to confide in is another Christian. It doesn't have to be a group of Christians. It can be. But people that you trust, people you know care about you, people that love you and love the Lord, because that's what the church is there for. What I want you to remember is that when we struggle, people are listening to us. Thank you. And Johnny, lead us in prayer.